Great. Well, thank you so much, David and Will, and thanks very much for having me here. And my goodness, what an important moment we are at now. As someone who is obviously political, but also a political commentator, we always say this is the most important set of elections that there's ever been. But this time we really genuinely mean it, because my goodness, what happens here in the United Kingdom and what happens in America not just shapes what happens in those countries and for those citizens, but it really shapes the rest of the world in this incredibly important moment. Will, I'm going to start with you. I mean, it is fascinating that you have, a centre-left government in America, which has arguably done so many of the things that we as progressive people here are kind of straining at the seams to do, and you guys have done that. Yet you're at a moment of great peril. And we here in the UK, we've not been in power for a long time. Our polls are looking good, but as David said, there's no complacency. What lessons do you draw from what's happening in here, and what should we in Labour learn from what you guys have been through?
Yeah, I hope you don't learn much from from us now, because this is an election that we should be leading in. We're up against a positively deranged person in Donald Trump, and yet we're behind now. That is partly the result of the mistakes we've made, but it's largely the result of this inflationary surge. As you pointed out, and a lot of Europeans can't understand why Americans aren't more enthusiastic about Bidenomics, about the big bills, the big investments that Joe Biden got through on a very narrow margin, very little room to maneuver, and it was an impressive achievement. But what happened was that inflation surged, and that inflation undermines the working middle class. It robs people of their purchasing power, and even though we've driven it down, from 9 to 3-something%, people still go to the grocery store and feel the pinch, feel the pain, and they're not in a mood to be hearing about the wonderful things that are going to happen down the road. And so Joe Biden has passed $1.6 trillion worth of investments in America's future, and they're going to pay off. But only 17% of that money has been committed. And so people haven't had the opportunity to see the fruits, see the results of these enormous public investments in clean energy, in healthcare, in general modernization of our infrastructure, in innovation. We're very keen on staying in the vanguard of innovation and sort of a contest with China for primacy there. And so these are all really important national investments, but the benefits haven't, connected yet. So you asked about lessons. Let me just close with this thought. One thing that's really impressed me about Keir Starmer and Team Starmer is the discipline. That we watched it since 2019. Just the methodical repairing of damage, the methodical building of trust, projecting of calm, reassuring voters on things that they're not, that they're worried about the party on, and not getting out over your skis. And I think there's a lesson in that. I think we tried to do a lot at once,
right,
and voters lost the theme sometimes because there was a lot going on, and they didn't know what was more important and what was less important. And I see this discipline here, and I wish that we could borrow a lot from you.
Fascinating, really interesting. I mean, David, we've heard there a very kind of, I'd say, ruthlessly honest. I'm really impressed. Well, you could have been like, it's all great. We're doing all of this stuff, because that's often the lens that we put on as progressives in terms of, when I'm commentating, we say, oh, Biden's doing all this great stuff. You've been really, really honest. I mean, David, as somebody who's part of the leadership team, so close, it's so tantalizingly close. But watching what's happened in America must also send a wee bit of a shiver down your spine, because you could have this brilliantly smart, well-intentioned, progressive centre-left government who came in, they thought, we want to do so much, it's not translating into getting food on the table for people, those bread and butter issues. I mean, you could have this extraordinary thing where Biden's done so much. The metrics might be very good actually for Trump, you know, down the track, but we don't live in an era of grateful voters. What's the cautionary tale that you take from what you've just heard from Will?
Well, look, we've got to fight for every single vote, and we've been very careful to say that Britain is in such a mess that the project that we're engaged on is 10 years of renewal to change this country. And look, we're standing at a bit of a crossroads. We don't know if our friends in Australian Labour will get a second term at this point, when you look at the polls in Australia. We don't know if our friends in Germany will get a second term. And of course, we're fighting to get this next term, but we know the project is much longer than the 5 years that we get. And that's why I wanted to reference in my speech the moments where much has been suggested in the polls, but actually we've missed the target. The electorate is very volatile at the moment. Social media plays an outsized role. And no doubt about it, when you've got the sort of brief that I've got, you know, in our system, we've got this system, you know, I'm a privy councillor, which does mean that, you know, I get certain intelligence briefings, and we do have a lot of outside interference in our election cycles. There's a lot of debate when I was in Washington last week about the role of TikTok and the Chinese state at this moment in time. So we just can't take anything for granted. And we know that despite how well we are doing, we will be outspent by the Conservatives at the next election. They will have more money than us, and they will play dirtier than we have ever seen in this election cycle. So for all of those reasons, we are fighting for every single vote. It's about that personal relationship you build with voters, not just through your comms, but on the doorstep in your communities. And the good news, I think, about the local elections and those local election results is that you're seeing that our field campaign, that campaign on the ground where it matters, is beginning to work.
Absolutely, and you know, it's worth saying that those local elections, of course, you can't extrapolate everything from local elections to a general election, but my goodness, what a direction of travel, a phenomenal set of results, which really does show that the UK Labour Party seriously got its act together in terms of strategy, in terms of its ground operation, and also its efficiency in terms of how it uses its resources. However, and this is not to cast a cloud over the good results, you know, there were areas of concern. You're the shadow foreign secretary. The situation in the Middle East and Gaza played into some of those results. Of course, Biden is facing that pressure as well. David, I'll come to you for a moment, in a moment. How should the UK Labour Party navigate the Gaza situation in terms of the morality of the Gaza situation and the values that we hold as the Labour Party, as well as the raw politics of an upcoming election?
Well, look, let's begin with the fundamental statement, and you hold these two things at the same time. We want to see hostages that have now been taken from their families for over 7 months returned home. And that is in the hands of Hamas. Anyone who has looked at the horrors of the women and children, now well over, I mean, the numbers just going up and up and up, thousands of people who have lost their lives. We also want to see a ceasefire now. It must stop. And we repeat that, and we repeat that, and we repeat that. And the global community is in that place. They want a ceasefire now. We also know, though, that as much as we want that ceasefire, it is not in our hands. It is in the hands of Hamas and the Israeli government. But let me also be absolutely clear. The British Labour Party is opposed to a further offensive in Rafah. Where thousands more people will lose their lives. And President Biden is right. Whilst we, of course, stand by Israel and our forces play such an important role stopping those drones flying in from Iran, landing and killing civilians in Israel and Jordan, and we stand by Israel, and of course we'll continue to stand by Israel in those circumstances. He's right. He's right. We can't be sending arms when we are opposed to that further intervention in Rafah, and we've got to be clear about that as well. Look, all of us here, as we head into this election cycle, hope and pray that we will get that ceasefire and that this awful, awful war will not be a backdrop to our elections here or elections in the United States.
So just to be clear, if you were Foreign Secretary now, would you be taking a tougher line on arms?
We support what Biden said this week, but we've also been calling for the government now for well over a month to publish the legal advice. It is important that the British people are comforted and clear that we are not complicit in any breach of international humanitarian law. And this party is a party that fought for the rules-based order, that fought for that international humanitarian law architecture that we have in the world. We have a leader who was an international humanitarian lawyer. We will not compromise on those issues, and we have never compromised on that from the very, very beginning of this crisis.
Will, Gaza and the conflict in the Middle East is really dominating US politics as well, particularly with the Democrats' base. How does Biden navigate this? I mean, he has come under some criticism from progressives.
Well, it's an issue. There's no question about it. It's a difficulty for him. I mean, speaking politically here, not on the merits of the question, but I don't think it's dominating. The protests on campus are fairly narrow, small numbers of people, and but they're getting a lot of attention. They're getting saturation coverage from aboard media, but I don't think they're dominating American politics. And I think that the president also, in addition to his strong message to Israel, which is the right one, you can't just use any means necessary. You've got to find a way to prosecute this war to a successful conclusion, but taking maximum care to minimize civilian loss of life. And that they have not done. So the president's right about that. But he's also right that a lot of the protesters have been mouthing Hamas slogans and have not been willing to say that what Hamas did was really wrong. It was unacceptable, it's depraved and inhuman. And casting it as as part of the legitimate responses to occupation and, as they would say, apartheid. So the president's been pretty tough with the protesters and pretty unyielding on Hamas's, the fact that they started this war and the horrors that befell Israel on October 7th have to be condemned. And that hasn't happened on campus. And we've also seen a kind of an outburst of anti-Semitism. I believe you all had some problems with that as well, and Biden is taking care that we not be affected by that on the Democratic side.
Now, before we move on from this topic, we were discussing, and of course we're all talking about the closeness of the race at the moment. And of course, as you were just saying to us, the huge country of America actually comes down to about 6 states. Do you think this issue could do Biden serious damage come that very, very tight race?
It's possible that we have a concentration of Muslim Americans and Palestinian American votes in Michigan. Michigan is one of the 6 states. It's a crazy situation. We've got a big country, but the election is really only going to happen in 6 states because popular vote doesn't elect the president. States do through the Electoral College. And we know how all the other states are going to vote already. So hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be lavished on these 6 states, as happens every time. I hate to see the ratio, per capita political spending. But so yes, it's going to be tight in these 6 states again. President's a little underwater now, in these states, but I don't think that's terribly meaningful because it's more a reflection on sort of a referendum thought than they aren't thinking about the choice which they're going to face in November yet. But in Michigan, we have Muslim Americans who've been mad. They're angry. They've been letting their anger known, and that in a tight race, small numbers of votes can make a very big difference. So we're hoping that isn't going to happen. I should just add, though, that it's kind of crazy for an American Muslim to vote for Donald Trump or to take actions that will allow Trump to be elected, because this guy, as you know, he's promised to not only resurrect his Muslim ban from when he was president, but to expand it to include other Muslim countries. Only a few were affected last time, and has zero sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians. It's made it clear he doesn't care what happens to them. Would put no restraints on Netanyahu, and so I have to feel in the end that people are going to make a sober calculation there that you may be unhappy with the way Biden's handled the situation, but if Donald Trump gets in, there will be absolutely no sympathy for the Palestinian cause.
Now, before we move on to wider geopolitics, look, Donald Trump is a possibility, a distinct possibility. You've just come back from DC. You've been meeting with people from all sides, including the Trump team. How are you psychologically preparing for the prospect, if you are Foreign Secretary, your relationship with the possibility of a Trump administration? And give us some insights in terms of your recent trip and meeting the Trump team.
Well, look, I mean, I think the starting point is to say that in our system, the UK and the US are very closely aligned. That's why we talk about a special relationship, and it doesn't matter who's in number 10 or the White House. We have a shared intelligence capability that is second to none. I saw the importance of that in the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where it was our shared intelligence that was able to warn the world of what was about to happen. And we saw again with our military working alongside the US, our ability to stop those drones from Iran landing in Israel and landing in Jordan and killing lots of civilians and kicking off an escalation of what is already an horrendous war. So the seriousness of having to work with whoever becomes American president is really, really important. The second thing to say is, at a time when there are less democracies than there were 20 years ago, 71% of the world is living under an environment where there is no press freedom, which we take for granted. Whatever our views about our political opponents, we do have to give thanks that people are able to go to the polls and make their determination, whatever that is. And I'm very, very grateful to the democratic tradition and our values that we are seeking to defend. What I saw in the United States when I was there last week, and I spoke to Trump's campaign managers, I did see a campaign very well organized. We forget that Donald Trump's first campaign was shockingly organized. He still won, but it was shockingly organized. His second campaign was really run over by the pandemic and a sense that he had completely lost control of the narrative. But this campaign is phenomenally well organised.
In what kind of way?
Well, they're on the data. They're looking closely at the 6 states that matter. There's some evidence that there are working class voters, particularly, that are moving across and over to the Republicans. That includes, for example, the black male demographic in the key swing states that matter. They are on it, and they are also prosecuting hard the issues that we know matter on the doorstep. They're talking about cost of living. They're talking about petrol prices. They're talking about jobs lost. Those are the things that matter on the ground. And we've just got to be a little bit careful because sometimes in the progressive tradition, when we talk about economics, it's lots of fancy words and it's macroeconomics.
Seminar, isn't it?
It's a seminar.
Seminar.
It goes on for hours. It doesn't work on the doorstep. People don't know what our message is. And both Democrats and Labour have that problem. And then there's a second problem. Abortion does matter in the United States, for sure. What happened on January the 6th matters in the insurgency that Donald Trump led. And of course, it's important that there is a candidate running for office who's caught up in lots of legal cases. But let us not forget that the vast majority of people will be voting on the basis of how this affects my family. Can I put food on the table? What kind of schools and healthcare do my kids have? And we mustn't lose sight of the lessons that our movement learnt, principally from Bill Clinton and Tony Blair.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, no question about it. And that's, unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the last time we had a severe bout of inflation in the United States. That was the 70s going into the early 80s. And incumbents presiding over inflationary regimes, I don't care what country you're in, it's never a pleasant place to be. They tend to lose elections because inflation really whacks away at middle class purchasing power and economic optimism. And so that, and we didn't talk enough about it. We extolled the great, large investments that the president has made. That's understandable, but we can't fall into the trap, as a friend of mine calls it, of the deluded, thankless wretches theory of the electorate. That they should be hailing these achievements, and be more grateful than they're showing, because they're suffering out there, and we have to speak to that daily pain. We could have done a better job of that. Having said that, abortion is going to be really an important issue for us. It's going to be very powerful, and we're going to prosecute it to the max, because it's a major vulnerability for Trump.
Okay, final question. We spent a lot of time talking about America and Britain, which is really important, but just to kind of sort of to zone out kind of a geopolitical stage. I mean, it does feel that probably in all our kind of adult lives, geopolitics has never felt more fragile than it does right now. We've had leaders talking about the world being in a kind of pre-war state, even though there are two and many more conflicts going on, of course, Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East. We're seeing a kind of realignment of the world order, the rise, of course, of China, India. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the great rise in many African countries as well. But the sort of world order is shifting. I mean, David, if you become Foreign Secretary, which of course we all very much hope you will, you want Britain to be back on that world stage, and you talk about this progressive realism. But it must also keep you up at night thinking, goodness, the world is really unstable at the moment, and things are shifting so quickly at the moment.
Look, it's the most challenging geopolitical environment in so many ways in my lifetime. But this is my 24th year in public life. I remember growing up, and I'm looking out at the audience. It's a young, beautiful audience, but there are some folk a little bit older.
Young and beautiful. You sound like Donald Trump there. Young, beautiful. You're all young and beautiful.
And who were growing up in the Cold War. And I remember we were so scared of nuclear war. There were these films that were horrific.
Threads.
Threads.
Oh my God.
You'd shake at this film.
Scariest film ever.
So the Cold War was pretty bleak. And then we had, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Empire, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. Remember that, 1990? We had this sort of golden period that lasted for 2 decades. But what I would say is this. Let's just remember what is possible. The first thing is Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world. We have a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. We are a major G7 nation. We play an outsized role in relation to issues like development that connect us also to the global south. And what is at stake a bit later on this year? What's the upside of what we're talking about in terms of the general election? It is possible that Joe Biden is in the White House, that Keir Starmer is in number 10, Schultz will still be in power in Germany, Macron will still be in power in France, Trudeau will be in power in Canada, and Albanese will be in power in Australia. This could be a huge progressive moment that our movement will not have had since Blair, Clinton, Keating, and others were in power. That is a huge opportunity to change the world, and we should be upbeat about the possibility of that in the months ahead.
Right. What a powerful and optimistic, hopeful note on which to finish. What a fascinating discussion. Please give a warm round of applause to Will Marshall and to David Lammy.